We usually think of learning as this straight line going up, right? Like the more you learn, the smarter you get, and naturally, the better you can teach others. But actually, the data tells us an entirely different, almost backward story. Today, we're diving into this explainer to unravel a real cognitive mystery. We're going to look at the strange relationship between what we know, how our brains completely misinterpret information, and why the absolute most vital skill you can develop isn't actually learning at all.
Now, what's really interesting here is how this challenges a super basic assumption we all have, that knowing more automatically makes you a better teacher. But think about it. Have you ever asked a brilliant mathematician to explain basic algebra, or maybe a master chef how to just chop an onion, and they just kind of stumble? They might say, well, I don't know, you just do it, right? There's no way they're just being difficult. We assume expertise equals clarity, but the journey to becoming an expert fundamentally changes how your brain stores information. It essentially locks it away from simple explanation. Okay, let's jump into section 1, the paradox of expertise. So the crucial point here is that acquiring all this immense knowledge actually creates a barrier. It leads to this provocative idea that when it comes to explaining things, experts basically know almost nothing. Seriously, when you first learn something, you process it step by step. Just think about when you first learned to drive a car. It's mirror, brake, clutch, gear, gas. But as you become an expert, your brain automates those processes to save energy. The knowledge becomes completely unconscious. Those individual steps, they just dissolve into one fluid, intuitive motion. So when you ask an expert to explain their process, they literally cannot access those foundational steps anymore. Their advanced knowledge has basically completely paved over the beginner's roadmap, creating this massive communication blind spot. Let's move on to section 2, humans versus computers. We hear this metaphor all the time, right? That the human brain is like a computer. Well, scratch that. It's actually a terrible comparison. Human learning is incredibly messy. It's tied to our emotions, our stress levels, even whether or not we had a good cup of coffee this morning. We don't just, download a PDF of instructions straight into our neural pathways. We learn through trial, error, context, and association, and this organic messiness is beautiful, really, because it allows for creativity and intuition. But it also leaves us incredibly vulnerable to cognitive traps that rigid systems just don't fall into. This perfectly illustrates the core differences. When a computer needs information, it runs a rigid, systematic query and pulls exact, unchanged data right from a hard drive. But the human brain, it reconstructs memories and knowledge on the fly, piece by piece. Because our learning is organic, we rely heavily on shortcuts and patterns just to make sense of the world quickly. Now, this makes us highly adaptable, for sure, but it also makes us incredibly susceptible to making the wrong connections, which brings us to a very dangerous byproduct of organic learning. And that brings us to section 3, the false alarm trap. By defining this concept of a false alarm, we can see exactly where things go wrong. See, our brains evolved to keep us alive, not to be perfectly rational or objective. So if you hear a rustle in the bushes, your brain instantly screams, "Tiger, run!" even if it's literally just the wind. That right there is a false alarm. And in the modern world, this happens cognitively all the time. We experience a failure, a rejection, or just a really complex situation, and our brain hastily connects the wrong dots just to protect us. We misinterpret the stimuli, and we end up creating a takeaway that is completely, fundamentally misleading. This quote, "The false lesson of false alarms," is absolutely crucial. It highlights how a single false alarm can completely derail our understanding and install an entirely incorrect lesson into our cognitive framework. Let's say you try to launch a new project at work and it fails miserably, simply because the market timing was off. But your brain, triggered by all that stress and the false alarm mechanism, concludes, "I am terrible at launching projects and I should never try again." That is the false lesson of a false alarm. Yes, you learned something, but what you learned is completely untrue. You've basically written bad code into your mental software based on a misinterpreted survival mechanism. It is vital we recognize the impact this has on our daily life. These aren't just abstract psychological concepts. These false lessons secretly guide your everyday choices. You might be avoiding amazing opportunities simply because of a past false alarm. These lessons reinforce your cognitive blind spots, essentially making you an expert in a false reality. And ultimately, you just cannot learn the truth until you clear away the falsehood. Now for our final pace, section 4, the art of unlearning. Now that we've diagnosed the problem, we have to look at the solution. Unlearning isn't simply forgetting. Forgetting is passive, right? It just happens naturally as time passes.
Unlearning, on the other hand, is a highly active, deliberate technique. It's kind of like pulling up the floorboards of your mind just to find the rotten wood. It is the conscious decision to identify a belief you've held on to, realize it's based on a false alarm, and intentionally dismantle it. And honestly, it is arguably a much harder skill than learning, because it requires you to actually admit that a foundational piece of your knowledge is flawed.
By breaking this down into a technique, we can actively untangle those false alarms. Step 1 is all about awareness. You have to catch yourself in the act of relying on a false lesson. When you feel a sudden resistance to a new idea, or when you confidently declare, well, that's just how things are done, pause for a second. Ask yourself, is this objective truth, or is this just a false alarm from my past? Once you recognize it, you move to step 2, actively discarding it. This means forcing yourself to act contrary to the false lesson, testing the waters, and proving to your organic, messy brain that the old rule just no longer applies. As we wrap up this explainer, we've seen how accumulating knowledge can actually blind experts, and how our human brains are literally wired to sometimes learn the exact wrong lessons just to protect us. True growth isn't just about endlessly stacking new information on top of a flawed foundation. Actually, sometimes the absolute most powerful thing you can do for your growth is to subtract. Take a hard look at your habits, your assumptions, and your certainties. Find those false alarms. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. What do you need to unlearn today?